I think this is a great episode.
I think it's a cracker. I mean, I'm biased. I'm a huge fan of Judy and the work she's done and continues to do. But awesome conversation today.
Absolutely. And we didn't even get to all of the bits in the show notes, so we'll have to have a follow-up.
I think we need to, because we hear more about the torchbearing for the Sydney Olympics.
Yeah. So what did we discuss?
We talked about commercialization of research out of universities and the challenges there, but how she managed to successfully navigate that.
Yeah. And then that transition into the government role, I thought was quite interesting, and the work that the government does broadly, which also led us to talk about gender diversity in capital raising and startups. And I think that was a good conversation to have.
Yeah, really good conversation. And also just about the investment landscape, the virtues of places like South Australia and Adelaide, and why they do become a bit of a factory for really good entrepreneurs.
No, absolute hats off to the South Australian government for having that role where you've got someone like Judy, who's an absolute operator, from founder, investor,
director. Like, she's lived on every pillar of the innovation ecosystem, both in public and private markets, through universities, on investment committees. Like, there are a few other Aussies that have that depth of experience. So it's fantastic she's in that role.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it.
Let's kick it off. So Judy, absolutely stoked to have you on the podcast. I've known you for a fair while.
Yeah, don't tell anybody how long, Aaron. That would be way too embarrassing.
I feel like we should be having this conversation today over a gin in some sort of London underground bar. But in the absence of that, we'll do it remotely.
The gin.
Not by Adelaide time. Only the rest of the world. Yeah. But no, absolutely stoked to have you on. And you're an interesting one, Judy, in the sense that you're one of those rare people that have worn so many hats across the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
You've been a founder, you've been a policymaker, you've been a director, you've been an inventor, you've been an investor, you've been in the public market, private market, you've been in universities, you've been working on commercialization. I don't know of anyone else actually that's hit as many of the pillars of the innovation landscape as you have. So there's no shortage of things.
Like it must be 800 years old.
Just incredibly talented. So I'm absolutely stoked to have you on today. Yeah. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Judy, I'm keen to maybe go back to the commercialization part of your career. And actually, for the listeners, maybe talk a little bit about the research areas that you were involved in those days. Maybe kicking off at coming out of university and moving into research and then quickly moving into commercialization. Could you talk us through that little bit of evolution of your career path?
Yeah, look, I went down the academic career path track pretty early on. I was one of those, as I suspect many entrepreneurs are, irritating people who's always going, but why? And research is the perfect environment for that sort of stuff. I've always been interested in how can you use the power of that research and inquiry to make things better, and particularly got involved in disease research, drug development, new treatments and therapies for difficult conditions, with a focus on, back in my research career days, on some of the really minutely interesting to only 3 people in the world metabolic pathways involved in cancer, particularly around the kind of cell surface molecules that decorate different types of cells and help the body determine whether or not that's friend or foe. So that was where my research career was back in the day. And as I said, pretty much, very much applied focus. I always wanted to be closer to the actual get a product to a customer end of research, understanding that in that field, that's a good 15-year journey. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be long and expensive. So very early on had collaborations and collaborators and partners in the kind of biotech space. And so went out, we got grant funding, the usual academic stuff, get grant funding. A lot of that was applied grant funding, really focused on the product in particularly the biotech space. And very early on went out into a biotech startup based in Brisbane, and they called Alchemia. In the late 90s, early 2000s is where I was at Alchemia for a long time. And it was the Wild West of venture funding and all manner of things in Australia back then. If we think it's the Wild West now, it was even wilder west then. But really very much in the new treatments for difficult diseases spaces is where my kind of research activities were. And Alchemia was very much an R&D business.
Yeah. And so I was looking at it up a little bit. So they were ASX listed and a claim to fame in that the first Australian biotech to actually, was it acquire or merge with another listed entity as well? It seemed like a great success story, but I imagine, what was that era like in terms of commercializing research? Like you said, you described it as the Wild West. Was capital an easy thing? Was a public market the only way to secure that type of capital you needed?
It was quite early on in the Australian venture capital sector, let's call it. And in that very much deep tech space, so tricky, difficult things, Alchemia raised close to $30 million in venture capital in Australia when the venture capital pool of funding was around about $300 million.
That's like 10% of the market.
Right. And it was on the one hand, more difficult because you had such a very constrained environment, but on the other hand, somewhat easier because now the complexity of the capital markets is much greater for founders and startups than it was back then. There's all manner of different types of structures of capital. There's venture capital, there's obviously angel investors, but you can get, venture debts, you can do equity crowdfunding. There's all other kind of exotic types of things. There's secondary markets, that sort of stuff was not around back then. And we were on a trajectory. The conventional wisdom back then, the path was, let's build up the value in the business. Let's get a product that's ready to list on the NASDAQ, because that's where you can get, and you go and list a company and you get a great exit for your investors and you get much higher valuations than you'd ever get here, that kind of thing. And so we were on that path, but we were ready to list. We were planning to list, done all the filings, established the US subsidiary, and then those airplanes flew into those buildings in the September of the year we were going to list in the October. And it was disaster. So for the business, so much disaster for the globe, basically. But yeah, we had to really rethink your strategy very quickly, come back to Australia, get rid of your US subsidiary, tap your investors for another little bit of funding. They were very patient investors, as it turns out. And we eventually listed on the ASX in December 2003. But it was a really, we'd lived through the dot-com bubble stuff and got a decent valuation in the US and then bang. So it was an interesting and pretty challenging time.
Yeah. And what a phenomenal period to be like navigating through. We talk about change loops and that the founders that succeed are those that can navigate the change loops quickly and still survive. But that's phenomenal. I want to go back. There was something you said there. You almost implied it was easier as a founder, not necessarily easier to raise capital, but there was less complexity. When the VC market was smaller, there was one path or maybe just a few pathways in terms of commercializing. It was heading towards the NASDAQ. I hadn't thought of that perspective before, but I think that rings true. There's a lot more products, there's a lot more providers, there's a lot more nuances to what each different VC firm is looking for. Do you think though, in terms of commercializing research, do you think it's easier now or more difficult?
To some extent, it makes it more difficult because your pathway has so many potential side forks in the road, let's call them, and navigating, thinking about particularly in the kinds of businesses that I was mostly involved with, which have a very long period of spending lots of money and not making any revenue. They're a long way from profitability. They're a long way from revenue generating often. And navigating that pathway is quite a lot more complex now than it was. That said, there is more capture in the marketplace. There are more people with expertise and experience in the marketplace. You can get good advice. There are lots of support structures and things in place that just did not exist back then. It was all a bit, let's give it our best shot and we'll see what happens. It was a giant experiment in some respects because there were not hundreds of people who've been down this pathway before. There were maybe 5 or 10 and you'd be lucky to find them. The system itself has grown. Along with that, complexity has grown. But on the other side of the ledger, there is then that better capability and expertise, and your ability to mitigate risk when you've got choices is better.
And for those that are looking to commercialize research, where do you see them go wrong? Might be too strong a word, but people that aren't getting their research commercialized effectively, what could they be doing better?
I think it's a different perspective on the founder falls in love with their technology and can't imagine that nobody loves it as much as they do. It's a similar sort of problem. Research, particularly that comes from fundamental inquiry, you accidentally find something, oh, this looks interesting. in some respects, finding that product market fit can be very tricky. We think this is really, it's a solution looking for a problem type of thing. That's not universally true because, for example, most medical therapies, there's a clear unmet medical need. You don't need to go and talk to a customer. There's X number of patients suffering with this disease in the world. The opportunity is massive. The challenge there is more who's going to, the person paying is not the same as the person using. And sometimes those things are not, finding that product market fit's not that easy. I think it's still the same problem. It's just getting your head above I'm really interested in the very technical detail of the thing that I'm doing, and wow, isn't that amazing? And understanding, getting from that, wow, that's amazing moment in a deep research environment to an actual something that somebody can use in the real world is massively complicated. And often people are underestimating the time, complexity, and cost associated with that.
I think there's a really interesting point there around that the person using it often isn't that customer. And I probably 15 years ago somehow found myself as a top 10 shareholder in a medical device firm that was making a machine that allowed, instead of using catheters to do some things which were highly invasive, sepsis, all of that, this entrepreneur designed something from the outside and raised, I think, 32 million in an IPO from the who's who. And that was all very exciting because they had studies that validated this approach out the wazoo, like just unbelievable. What we didn't realize is that hospitals actually make a fair clip of money out of the catheter procedures. They're covered by insurance. And if you then create a device, you're now competing on the capital budget for the hospital. And then you've got the whole change management process with the clinicians. And after 15 years or like even more, what's it been now? It's still, the technology's great. It's validated. I don't want to see another report, but the market conditions were such that it was just created this unbelievable barrier that we didn't see to begin with.
Yeah, and there's often in that particular, in the healthcare sector, there's some perverse incentives sometimes for things because the patient gets whatever treatment it is, whoever the provider of that treatment is, has some kind of cost structure around that is also a barrier to then the regulatory framework, which doesn't really so much consider that. It's considering patient outcomes, and hospitals are different. And it's a tricky thing. It's very different in different jurisdictions.
And I guess the other challenge as well, commercializing research, is actually getting the IP out of the university or others and structuring that in a way that you can still be invested in. And universities often cop a lot of criticism. I think it might be a bit of a knee-jerk criticism, but I'm keen to hear your perspective. Alchemy was a spin out of UQ. You've worked with Uniseed.
Yep.
What are you seeing in the market? Is commercialization out of universities getting easier or improving?
I think probably it would be fair to say it is getting easier in certain places. There's again a degree of capacity and capability that's really built up over many years of experimenting around that to work out what's valuable and what's not. It's a tricky one because universities have an interesting arrangement with their research staff as in terms of intellectual property, because researchers go out there and find funding for their research from places other than the university. But it's a bit of a kind of collaborative joint venture arrangement, for want of a better term. And so unlike if you work for BHP, Telstra, or any other large enterprise, when you sign up to a contract, it's very clear that anything you invent at work belongs to them. You get nothing. That's your job to do that thing. Lots of case law now around how that's different in universities. Added complexity being often it involves development of IP, involves students who own their own IP because they're not employees of the university in any capacity. So there's some real complexity around that has to be managed. And over the years, that's changed. It used to be people wanted to own their own IP, but then the tax treatment of passing over that kind of an asset meant that your researchers would be ending up with a massive tax bill for something that had actually zero opportunity to give you any revenue for the next 15 years. And so there was some real complexities with all of that. And so universities kind of structure arrangements such that they license intellectual property or even assign intellectual property, but with some rights coming back. And they're variably trailing royalty type arrangements and that sort of thing, that they want research rights. Some of that's not really unreasonable. And it's also changed a lot over time. In the early days in Australia, the venture funds really wanted you to have the whole lot assigned and no trailing royalties, and they just went. And so that made for some very uncomfortable discussions. That's changed massively now. It's easier and there are pathways. It's for all the reasons that I just mentioned, it's very complicated because of the numbers of people involved. There's patents and you've got 20 inventors and everyone has to assign and all this kind of stuff. It just gets to be quite tricky.
Yeah, I've had a couple of calls with 2 founders in the last few weeks who are currently negotiating the extraction of IP out of different universities. But the thought that comes to mind as well is the inventor isn't necessarily that great as a founder to actually commercialize it. And I'm curious with your own journey, you've obviously got a very commercial mindset. You've sat on the investor side of the table and there's a few things absolutely want to talk about there, but how did you transition? Like, what was that influence that enabled you to bridge research into being quite commercial as well?
I've always had propensity and an interest in that more commercial stuff, right back to the early days of when I was at school. Not going to that dark history, but it's not so far behind us now we can hardly see it. But at some point, I'm a kind of an action-based person, and when you become successful in a university environment, it becomes harder to control a lot of things, and you get involved in a lot of outside of what you're focused on, activities and committees and what have you. And your ability to get to the point you want to get to is constrained. Now, that was that point in time in my career. And I think as you get older, the view on things changes and how you interact with these things changes. I wouldn't make the same decisions now as I made then, obviously, because now I'm working for government. But it was about having that ability to not get so embroiled in the long-term discussions and make a decision, take action, move on. Let's get to the outcome. And my values are more aligned with that kind of an outcome than they might have been aligned with staying in an academic kind of career trajectory. Plus, if it's hard work getting grant funding through a good research team every year, in fact, you're hunting under rocks. It's probably more difficult to get capital in that environment than it is in startups, or it's equally as difficult. And that's a challenge for people who want to do research.
And what was the impetus of the transition into government? And for the listeners, what is that role that you've got? What did you see in it? And what do you do?
So just before I came here to South Australia, I came in at the end of 2019. I'd been involved in founding and spinning out a business out of UQ, but it had IP from different places. We founded the business in Atlanta in the United States. It was a big, complex beast with many different parties involved, many different institutions across many jurisdictions. We'd raised about $7 million in seed funding, done some clinical studies in the US, had a very quite complicated shareholders cap table, if you like. We had any number of safe notes or convertible notes or warrants and all sorts of interesting things in there. And we were fortunate enough eventually to raise capital from local investors here to go into the next round of clinical stuff. And I know that clinical stuff is not for me. It's very regulated when you're on that pathway, and it's much less messy than the early stage stuff where your risks are high and you're doing other different things, which I really enjoy. But it was from 2011 to 2016, that journey, and it was hard work 24/7. And I was exhausted. And I said to my husband, I don't think I can do that again. And at that point, somebody said to me, they've started up this new thing in South Australia. There's this new structure that they're putting in place, and we want to spin up this kind of early commercialization support system for the ecosystem in South Australia, which includes an early stage grant scheme. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And I was ready to move from that high risk strategy where everything's in one into just doing a lot of different little things and living vicariously through the success of others.
You, in that support role that you do now, what kind of support do you provide?
We provide, our team has a range of different things that we do as government does to support the policy objective, which is all around biasing for success to create more of those sorts of businesses that are going to scale and grow revenue, bring investment capital in, grow jobs, and economic complexity, all of the kind of high level policy things that governments across this country are interested in. And so we have an early stage grant funding scheme. We do a whole bunch of other things. We started to operate startup up here. We run a whole bunch of other programs and things. We've supported people to go on missions with you guys for market entry kind of activities. So we try and focus on what support we can provide that'll help early stage businesses with capital, with customers, and with capability or talents, the three things that are the main challenges when you're first starting out. And so we do a suite of different things across the board, which may be either directly providing dollars into a business or many other indirect types of things. And to some extent, that's the role of government, is to put these things in place, and various businesses will either touch or not touch the bits that they need at the time that they need it. And so Mouth starts, and actually another thing that we've supported over the years is having those opportunities which are difficult to quantify the value of, but are immeasurably valuable.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to South Start. It's amazing to see the growth of that. And shout out, like, for any founders or investors or pretty much anyone in the ecosystem, South Start is that event you pretty much have to go to. And one of the things I love about it is, and I think this is one of the virtues of South Australia, with everyone traveling in for that event, everyone has the time to properly connect. And Danielle and Craig just do such a great job of building those moments to connect. But something you just said then, it just made me think, how do you measure the outcome of these policy interventions? Something like South Start, or funding people onto missions, or the venture capital development support. How are you measuring the impact the government is having?
Yeah, and that is a wickedly difficult thing to measure. I'm sure you'd be well aware of that. Calculating an ROI is very difficult because of the nature of time in this space. You do things now that have their impact down the track. So we do a variety of different things. And those people that get money from us have to report regularly. And so we do collect all of that information and data that you can then, once you start to get enough information, you can start to use some of those economic models to analyze the impact of, we put $1 in and we get this impact on GSP or GDP or whatever it might be. Multitudes of assumptions in there, which is always the case. I heard one of your earlier podcasts actually, and you were talking about your constant use of gross generalization. So we do a bit of that gross generalization stuff, make a whole bunch of assumptions. But effectively, when we look around our ecosystem, and you can see that visually if you log on to our deal room dashboard, and the same pretty much actually in other states across Australia, is that let's go back to the 2015, 16. In total, South Australian startups are probably raising around about 40 to 50 million in investment capital in one form or another. Now, annually, those businesses are raising collectively somewhere around $100 to $200 million a year. Now, the economic impact of that is massive. People have got that much more money to spend on goods and services, and depending on which assumption you use, there's a 1 to 5 multiplier in there. Other things are, we can look around the system now and see many businesses that are employing 10 and 20 and 30 and 50 and 100 people, and are selling their goods and services, getting revenue from markets in South Australia and in other global markets. There starts to become that energy, and what I'm sure you've heard about, for that kind of halo effect. People who've been successful in one business go and become repeat offenders and do it again in another business. And so all of these things are little bits of information that you can collect together and say, that's how we know how well the system's working. There are still many places where things could be much better, no doubt. And so it's a continuous process of, is that still working? Should we do it differently? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? There's quite a bit of thinking goes into that all the time.
And shout out to yourself, and being that I think the government often cops a bit of criticism from founders, investors, well, pretty much from anyone. But I think the fact that someone such as yourself is in this role and brings that expertise in, and people like Charlie Gunningham in WA or Jamie Merrick in Queensland that bring that operational experience into the role, I think is a testament to the outcomes, like what we're seeing as these outcomes. What's coming up in South Australia in 2024 and onwards that gets you excited?
Oh, look, I think it's that kind of growth. I feel like our system here is well into its teenage years now, and it consequently is a little bit more robust than it might have been. It's really easy to kill the system when it's very early by making some well-intentioned, but perhaps poor decisions. We've been very fortunate in South Australia to have had some continuity of things across multiple election cycles. And that's really the challenging space, I think, across any system, particularly where this government intervention is the kind of stop-start nature that you often get if there's a change in government and then you have to reframe the policy position or re-implement or do things differently. We've had a commitment to seeing this sector grow over multiple political cycles. And we see the benefit of that. You see the benefit of we've now got 7 odd years of continuous information about what impact our early stage grant funding is having. And that's substantial over time. And it gets on the hockey stick and off you go. And you really want to get to the hockey stick part.
One of the things that isn't hockey sticking is investment into female founders.
Right.
And we had some interaction online, which I thank you for. You've sat so broadly from the entrepreneur in government, investor across those, and you're a SheEO activator. What are your thoughts as to where does the challenge lie? What do entities like us need to be doing better? What's your perspective on this challenge? Because another report came out last week that showed a bit of improvement, but if you zoom out, it's still fairly anemic.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky and difficult question, largely because I think what needs to change is not easily observable and fixable and measurable because it's around people's perceptions, biases, conscious, unconscious, cultural norms, those sorts of things, which are extraordinarily difficult to move at any speed. It's something of a frustration because I'm sure you'd be aware of the data. The data is very clear. Diverse teams get better outcomes. Founders are extraordinarily effective and efficient with capital. They're very efficient with capital. You get more than $1 worth of effort out of it for every dollar that goes in. All of these things, there's data, this stuff. Businesses that have diverse teams do perform better. All of this data has been out there for a long time, but yet it's not just in funding for funding for female founders, but in all the things around company directors and our ASX listed businesses, like what's the stat, more Andrews than women or stuff back in the day. It's challenging because it is about the things that we do unconsciously all the time. I'm guilty of it just as much as anyone else. I'm just now at a point in my life where I can go, I really don't care what people think I'm going to call it if I can, and not in any kind of negative way. I think the trick is to think about this on the positive side. And part of that has been with good intention. I think over a long period of time, there's been a lot of emphasis on fixing women because they're broken. They need to be better at pitching. They need to be more aggressive. They need to be this, that, and the next thing. And you go, there's any evidence that suggests that? I think that's a construct we've made culturally that we keep pushing on, which has not given us the outcome that we wanted. So I think you have to think about things differently and just ask questions differently. And what's the solution? It's not going to be quick and easy. It's a bit about accepting we all have to change. It's easy when you're in the incumbency position to not want to change because that's a loss of control and a loss of power more than anything. And that has to be realized as a bad thing, not a good thing in some regards. We're all better if we have more diversity, if we really do take what is value and value it properly, then we should logically have these things, but we don't. And it's because of the trickiness of human behavior more than anything, I suspect.
Yeah, Aaron and I discuss it all the time. A small emerging venture capital fund has its top of funnel where deals come in, and it has its LPs, and we obviously have activities to drive the deals that come into the top. So we do all sorts of different things. And then for our particular mandate, at some point, at a certain point in the funnel, there are the investment opportunities that are within our thesis, within our different aspect. Even recently, we've had an increase in opportunities, but each time you sit there and go, okay, another predominantly male team. So then with our own values, so we believe in complementary teams, we believe in diversity. With you, that data is very clear. But then we look at it and say, okay, well, do we sit on the sidelines and not do these deals, which has its consequence? to us as an emerging business and we can't do that otherwise we go out of business. Where we've landed is, okay, well, what are the things we can influence? Well, when we're looking at these, we can actually implement side letters. We can actually have conversations. Do these people themselves believe in complementary teams? Can we then provide some influence at that advisory board kind of level? And then can we get better at engaging in parts of the ecosystem that we're not engaged in, where those deals could be coming? So we're finding it a struggle, but I don't know if you've got any feedback for us on those attempts.
No, I think everyone has to. Fundamentally, one of the really big challenges with this is that you've got two systems that are on very different baselines. And so anything that we fall back into, it's a merit-based system and that's what we do, is that you're just going to keep making this bigger and that's not going to catch up. Somehow we need to get to here, at which point you can say, yes, it's a merit-based system based on all of the objective quantitative things that we can look at. And then it truly is. But if you start from such inequity, it's really hard to do the things that you're talking about, Don. Your choices in this bigger pool here are more. So you can narrow down to what you think is going to be successful. Your choices in the smaller pool are not as many. So it's harder to find those things that are going to be successful. Now, I'm not sure what the answer is. And the organic change that we see over time is just not fast enough. Yeah, there's plenty of data in many different dimensions. Pay parity for women in the workforce, if we let it go organically, will take another 150 years or something. But that's nonsense.
Yeah.
So some of those levers have to be really legislated and forced in different ways. That's a different system than the kind of behavioral change system, which also has to happen, I think, at the same time.
And I guess my journey's been a reasonably recent journey, but once you start to put your feelers out into the world of understanding that bias does exist, you start seeing some weird things. And on Facebook, people do a gender reveal or whatever these days. I saw one on Facebook the other day and it's like the reveal was going to be, is this going to be a wizard or a witch? I'm like, well, why the fuck does the girl have to be a witch? And the people in the video were all like, the boys are automatically a bloody wizard. And I'm a big believer that people are a product of their environment. And so there's this whole cultural thing. But the more you actually look out, you just realize that.
Well, as somebody said to me not that long ago, it starts in the sandpit at kindergarten. If the boys are snatching the toys, they're being aggressive and showing great traits. And if the girls are snatching the toys, then they're given a negative spin on in some way or another. They're not sharing well.
Yeah.
The fact that you have that moment of realization, or you ask yourself, basically you're consciously asking yourselves these questions, is part of that change, I think, in behavior and culture. And I'm privileged enough to be able to look at a lot of things and go, have we got the balance here right? Are we bringing the right people to the table? I'm not going to a conference that has all their panels are 95% male. I'm just going to say no. I have that choice as a consumer to say no, because they shouldn't be only the voice of one half of the population. Never mind all of the other types of diversity and equity issues that exist. You can do what you can do, but it's also just thinking about it and those things that you have the ability to make some change in, then you make those changes where you can. And it's a tricky thing when you're making decisions that require you to think about hardcore financial implications, because that becomes more difficult than getting gender balance on a panel right. I totally accept that.
Yeah. And for us, as well as on the deal flow and founder side, it's also in our LP base, like our investor base is predominantly male. And so always thinking of different strategies or approaches to, reach out to different networks, try different forms of communication. For me, it's the unconscious biases, like the language, the wording. And this was something I learned during Startup Catalyst, was even some of the verbiage around our missions and scaling and growth and crushing it and all these things, we learned pretty quickly that they didn't resonate necessarily with a lot of female founders. And one thing I'm keen to get your perspective on, Judy, is like recently, one of our offsites, we funded 6 female founders to participate in the offsite. Previously, I've run actually 2 female founder missions, but actually got criticized for running those missions that were purely female founding, funding for female founders on the basis of, well, that's not fair. We don't want to be treated differently. These sort of criticisms. What's your perspective on programs that are specifically designed to activate and support female founders?
I think it depends a little bit on what the underlying impetus for that is. Why are we doing that? Because if it's, back to my previous comment, if it's we've got to fix you because you're broken, then I feel like that's probably not the right intent. If it's about understanding better how we can, in a more equitable world, provide the right services for you, because everyone's different and takes a different perspective and a different way of doing things. And it's also, sometimes it's about understanding the value. How we determine value probably needs a little, particularly in this sector, needs a little bit of thinking more deeply, because its value is not always just about the ROI in its really simple form. It's about who and how do they build good teams? What does leadership look like? What kind of outcomes do you get that have value, just not that necessarily easily calculable or tangible value? And how can we make that, disseminate that value more in both directions? Like, it's really tricky, Aaron, and I think you'll get criticism, doesn't matter what you do. It's the whole hearing that and trying to understand it in the context, and some criticism you just go, whatever. In others, you pay attention to with reason. So there isn't an easy answer. And I think till we get to this point where there needs to be something elevate to that point. And so there will need to be some things that are specific for that, because until you get to here, you can't truly do that merit-based assessment.
I'm a believer, if you want to end up in the center of something, if you're on the other side, you sometimes, the pattern is you've got to go in the other direction.
Yeah.
Quite a lot. But with this there, do you believe that there is any reason why we can't get to parity?
No, I don't think there is. I think it's there's some structural issues in all sorts of our institutions and other things that need addressing. There's individual culture and perception that needs addressing. It's going to be a work in progress for longer than I'm going to be involved in it, or you for that matter, I suspect. That doesn't mean to say they shouldn't be doing the work. There is work to be done and we should be doing it. And it can be, we'll try a bunch of things that are rubbish and we'll try a bunch of things that work really well. That's the nature of these things.
True.
Yeah, very true. Shifting gears a little bit, you've participated in things like AusBio, you've participated in London Tech Week, you've big advocate of founders getting on planes and also funding missions and delegates to attend. What's your kind of view on the role of trade missions and these types of things like AusBio and that? What's your perspective on them?
I think it's really important. It's very difficult in us. What's one of the big challenges that we have, that living here in this beautiful country on the other end of the earth to just about everyone else, with roughly 2% of any global market, doesn't matter which way you look at it, and an extraordinarily privileged existence by and large here. The reality of the world outside of our shores is really important to understand, because for success and scalable businesses, you need to, if we want to build that economic complexity in our country and do all of those things, people need to get into those markets, understand what's the network here, who are the people, what are the connections. Many founders will find, and this won't be a surprise to you, that if I want to enter the German market or the US market or the South American market, I'm going to need to have a presence on the ground there. I can't do that remotely from here, even if my business is a software as a service business that can be based anywhere, because people do business with people. And unless you build those networks, connections, relationships, it's much harder to get traction. It's much harder to understand the context, because context is always local for many things. And so you really have to get out there and do those things. And so we absolutely should be encouraging our founders and our entrepreneurs and people who've got ideas in business to get out there and get their hands dirty and around the streets wherever it is that you need to go, because that helps you make better business decisions.
So apart from not going to the place first, which sometimes happens when a founder decides to expand into a new region, Given your different experiences, what are some of the other mistakes that you see in that expansion phase that people don't quite get right that they could learn from?
So many simple things like understanding what the corporation structure is in different places. We have, again, quite regulated and pretty straightforward. People wouldn't necessarily believe me when I say that. If you're going to build a business and have activities in the United States, a salient, relevant example would be our friend Elon and his threats to move from Delaware to Texas. You need to understand what the legal environment is and the regulatory environment is, and that where you might be having arguments with potential partners, investors, or whatever it is. If you ever have to go to court, all of these things become very important and very expensive. And you can mitigate a lot of that early on if you think through some of those things. So it's the legal and the financial and the regulatory frameworks, and customers behave differently. People behave differently in different cultures, and you need to understand that as well. So there are thousands of things that you have to get your head around. You then need to prioritize which are the most important. Otherwise, you'll just run away screaming. But
it is such a good insight. And particularly the US with their litigious nature, knowing what jurisdiction you're setting up in and what that could potentially cost you in the future. You mentioned before, I think with Alchemia that you ended up in, was it Atlanta that you ended up launching out?
That was like a startup company. I did Q Oncology, it was called, before I came here. So based in Atlanta, because the co-founder was based in Atlanta. But we had a Delaware registered company just so.
You answered the question. Yeah, I was curious why Atlanta, but if the co-founder was based there, that's understandable.
Yeah.
What do you see? Like one thing I'm always curious about, South Australia, Judy, you could be based anywhere in the world. You could get a job in Silicon Valley in a heartbeat. Why Adelaide?
Because it is, I'm like a reformed smoker probably when you talk about South Australia. Don't come from here, don't have any family here. It is just the most exciting, beautiful place, fantastic food and wine, if you like that sort of thing. We're about to enter festivals. There's always a festival, but it's particularly concentrated around February and March here, where you could go out every night and see weird and wonderful stuff and just really be entertained enormously. And this was something that the chief entrepreneur from Queensland, Julia, said to me. She was here. South Australia, 0 degrees of separation.
There's a real community in those events as well. And yeah, it's a great vibe.
And I think it is that kind of, it's that big enough but small enough kind of thing here, is that you pretty quickly find the right person to have a conversation with or to work with or do whatever it is. And people are held to account pretty well because of that 0 degrees of separation thing.
Yeah.
So it's very collegial and collaborative. I think as the system's matured too, we've realized that our competitors are not people in the room or building next door. They're outside of our shores. And if we play well together, we're better off, all of us. And it's that kind of thinking that is really great. Yeah, I love it. It's a great environment to live and work in. Yeah.
And like you say, that investment environment has really started to get a flywheel around it. And we deal quite a lot with Josh from Southern Angels. So big shout out there.
Yep.
It's now got this sort of co-investment opportunity where beforehand for the other states, it may have been a bit too far. But when you have local trusted people that are able to find deals, do the DD, and then support them, it means that more money can flow that direction as well.
It was interesting. I think that I've heard 3 or 4 founders now say the 0 degree of separation means that it is more accountable. You can't get away with anything. So I think it's a great little behavioral paradigm, but it also reminds me of some of the key attributes of places like Tel Aviv and elsewhere is the super connected ecosystem and a small local market that forces you to have that more global mindset straight away.
Yeah.
And we see it in the South Australian founders we meet. Those that grow out of SA are just really great fundamental businesses.
Yeah. And that's very true. I think we do have in Australia, there's often a lot of discussion about the lack of a burning platform and the fact that we're all a bit complacent and it's just a bit too easy To some extent, there's less of that in South Australia because it is such a small market and because you're all held so much more accountable that you do need to get out a bit quickly, as you point out. I think that's one of the key things that we constantly have to energize across the nation into our founders and our entrepreneurs is, and you've got to move at speed and you've got to be curious outside of where you live.
And I think the other virtue is just less noise compared to some of those other markets. One of our chats with Adrian DeMarco, he was talking about the advantages of Technology One being based in Brisbane versus had it been based in Sydney, and the ability to capture more of the local talent to stand out signal to noise ratio.
Yeah.
So I think these environments, I think it is a real virtue actually of the Australian ecosystem that we have these types of subset ecosystems. I think it just make better entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think some of the data that comes from people like Startup Genome and the like tells you the same thing.
And that's why we have Jack, our analyst in Adelaide.
I know. We've seen Jack a few times, which is great. It's lovely to have him.
You can't miss him. He's 8 feet.
We're keen to see as many people as possible move to South Australia, notwithstanding some of the challenges just about anywhere with moving.
Yeah. No, we're really looking forward to getting down for South Start. We're going to get in for the full week. And then with Jack based down there, we're going to put a lot of time and effort into Adelaide and South Australia generally, which may or not coincide with some of those events that you mentioned before, but that's irrelevant.
Well, and hopefully it's an opportunity to find some of those gems that you can invest in down here. I think we're keen to that.
Yeah, because a lot of our LPs are based around our networks, one of our value propositions for them has to be finding stuff that they can't find themselves. And so that's, again, another reason why we need to be based in these areas where the average LP isn't stumbling around.
Yeah, that's one of the really fabulous things about this job is I get to see so many interesting things, meet some really interesting people just about every day. It just never ceases to amaze me, the power of human creativity and the ability to lead on. There's an issue, a problem here, and if I can make that work, that solves that problem for a whole lot of people who might actually pay for it.
Yeah.
So who cares question is always important.
But there's a lot of, like, Jack will report back on, I just had a meeting with this person and they did this or they knew that, or like all this stuff that's hidden away down there. It's just really fascinating to get involved in.
Yeah, that's really blown my mind. I consider myself moderately well connected in Adelaide, but Jack has just gone out and found new networks and new spaces and new founder groups. It's phenomenal, actually, the depth of things that he's just uncovered in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and there is some really, because people are busy doing what they're doing. They're not out there doing PR exercises and telling the world necessarily about it. And so sometimes you just unearth these things and you go, holy moly, that is just incredible. How come we didn't know about that? I like that part of the job.
It's the investment equivalent of the Garden of Unearthly Delights.
Right. And we're spending a lot of time there in the next few weeks.
Absolutely. No.
I think that's a really fitting note to end on, Judy, because that description you just gave, I think, is very apt for yourself. Like, just someone who has been head down, getting it done, contributing to the innovation landscape of Australia in so many different ways without ever a sense of ego or limelight or trying to hunt out fame or anything else. So yeah, I just want to say thank you and acknowledge all the work that you have done through your career.
I've loved every minute of it. It's just fascinating. I love it. It's just the inner nerds,
the curiosity.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's been great. Thank you so much. And thanks for the interactions that we've had online and making us think, and the support that you've provided, but mostly for those entrepreneurs in SA, having someone like yourself that can point them in the right direction is just so important. So,
well, I have to say I've got a great team that I work with who are equally as good at all of that, if not better than I am. So I can't take their credit. They're a really good group of people. So
absolutely.
Thanks so much, Judy. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks for South Start.
Looking forward to it.
See you then.
See ya.